Have you ever heard this phrase? Video games are the reason for gun violence, or video games create violence. I'm pretty sure you've heard those statements from the news and politicians every time violence occurs in the United States. Every school shooting, video games are to blame. Oh, someone robbed the bank is because Grand Theft Auto 5 has heist missions and that is corrupting our citizens. Ever since video games became a staple of pop culture, video games has been the scapegoat for the reason of violence. How can someone's hobby or profession cause war and violence? Why are the news and politicians creating this facade for video games? We all have our hobbies and interests, and it is not fair for these people to degrade and say inaccurate information about what we like to do. Ever since I touched my first gaming console, I keep hearing all these negative things about video games with no evidence. I played so many different genres of games such as RPGs, JRPGs, sports games, adventure games, story-driven games, and first-person shooters. And I have been ridiculed by my parents, teachers, and from the news. All my fellow gamers and I had enough with this gaslighting as well as making video games seem like a devil's creation. I am going to speak about how video games are not the cause of violence, debunk what the news and politicians said about video games, and provide an actual reason why violence happens. Before I reveal the actual causes of violence, let's begin on how video games are not creating criminals. Video games are methods of home entertainment and can be used as an escape from the real world. In addition, there are really good benefits that come with playing video games. According to Dr. Mark Griffiths, a professor of gambling studies in the psychology division at Nottingham Trent University, there are many reasons why video games can be useful educationally. He states that video games can assist children in setting goals, ensuring goal rehearsal, providing feedback, reinforcement, and maintaining records of behavioral change. He also states that video games also allow participants to experience novelty, curiosity, and challenge. This may stimulate learning. Video games can also help one's health. According to the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, eligible studies use video games to provide physical therapy, psychological therapy, improved disease self-management, health education, distraction for discomfort, increased physical activity, and skills for training solutions. Among 38 studies, a total of 195 health outcomes were examined. Video games improved 69% of psychological therapy outcomes, 59% of physical therapy outcomes, 50% of physical activity outcomes, 46% of solution skills outcomes, 42% of health education outcomes, 42% of pain distraction outcomes, and 37% of disease self-management outcomes. Now that we know the benefits of video games, let's learn about why the media and politicians are targeting video games for being the cause of violence. Ever since the popularity of violent video games, the media has shown their very biased opinion on those games, saying that it's too violent for kids and that these games create murderers. There has been no study that indicates that any video games create serial killers and criminals. However, there is a study that indicates that video games increase aggression. According to the National Center for Health Research, violent video games can also desensitize people to seeing aggressive behavior and decrease pro-social behaviors such as helping another person or feeling empathy, the ability to understand others. They also state that the longer that individuals are exposed to violent video games, the more likely they are to have aggressive behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. Even though violent games do increase aggression, there is no evidence that these games create violence. The National Center for Health Research states that it makes sense that since playing violent video games tend to increase the level of aggressive behavior, it would also result in more lethal violence or other criminal behaviors. But there is no clear evidence to support that assumption. Even if the media takes in consideration of that study, the politicians will stay gaslighting video games because they kept throwing misinformation about violent video games ever since the launch of Doom, which is a first-person shooter. The reason why politicians keep stating misinformation is because they are avoiding what is actually going on in their country. Patrick M. Markley, a psychology professor at Villanova University, and Christopher J. Ferguson, a psychology professor at Stetson University, both wrote a book that explains why politicians hate video games. Their book is called Moral Combat: Why the War on Violent Video Games is Wrong. In their book, they stated politicians seem more passionate in their rhetoric about video games than they did discussing mental health reform, the war in Iraq, poverty, or any number of issues urgently affecting the lives of young people. Another reason why politicians target video games is because politicians are creating a moral panic. According to Markey and Ferguson, a moral panic refers to a tendency for societies to develop overblown fears of an initial scapegoat or a folk devil, which is then blamed for a or often imagined social problem. Put in simply, a moral panic occurs when our fears of an object or activity greatly exceed the actual threat posed to society by that object or activity. Moral panics are usually the cause of spreading false information about anything advanced or technological. Markey and Ferguson confirms that by stating, very often when a new form of media or technology is released, society goes through a period of overblown fear in which this media or technology is blamed for a number of social ills, whether real or merely perceived. These panics can be explained in large part of generation gaps in adopting new technology or media. The young are far more proficient at adapting to innovation than are the old. This can create a perception among older adults that they are losing control of the culture they help shape, which of course they inevitably will, to the very youth they fear and view as morally bankrupt. Since now we know the reason why video games have been gaslighted by the politicians and media for decades, let's now learn about the actual reasons of violence. Violence has been hand to hand with history throughout time. We have recorded acts of violence in our history. The Civil War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the LA riots, and the Zoot Suit riots are examples of many violent events in U.S. history. However, the question still stands. What causes violence? According to the American Psychological Association, violence has many causes, including frustration, exposure to violent media, violence in the home or neighborhood, and a tendency to see people's actions as hostile even when they're not. Certain situations also increase the risk of aggression, such as drinking, insults, and other provocations, and environmental factors like heat and overcrowding. Wait, exposure to violent media, doesn't that correlate with violent games? It can be assumed it does correlate with violent video games. However, according to National Center for Health Research, it is important to keep in mind that violent video games exposure is only one risk of aggressive behavior. For example, mental health, adverse environments, and access to guns are all risks of aggression and violence. Now, those are the causes of violence that happens domestically, such as gang violence, domestic violence, mass shootings, and riots. Then, what are the causes of mass violence, such as war? According to I.W. Harfel, the author of the article called The Causes of War, wars in general then arise chiefly from economic conditions. In early times, that principal motive has either conquest, and the advantages arising therefrom are the securing maintenance of some special economic advantage. Harfel also states that other causes, of course, have occasionally risen into prominence, particularly an ambition of rulers, the desire of governing classes to aggrandise or protect themselves, the natural abundance and aggressiveness due chiefly to an ignorant and blind patriotism, and as a minor cause, differences in philosophic tenets with respect to government. Finally, after going through what the actual causes of violence really are, let's review what we learned. Today, we have learned that video games are not corrupting the minds of our children, rather than video games are helping our children learn about setting goals and learning how to respond to feedback. Video games also help with our health rather than creating violence in the world. We also learned that the media and politicians have been lying to us about video games and how they are trying to keep their moral panic alive, as well as the real causes of violence and war. Video games are not and will never be the causes of violence. I hope you will understand that video games are hobbies for people who like to experience out of this world experiences or who like to be productive in their spare time. It should have been known that video games are meant to entertain and teach us life lessons along the way, not to corrupt our minds, to commit murder, or to commit any type of violence, rather to give people a way to escape the real world, which can give the player a sense of relaxation and not a sense of violence. I encourage you to start playing video games if in your free time to see if you like it. If not, that's all right, because you now realize that people who play video games are not mindless creatures who only know violence and aggression. Thank you for watching.